Controversy 5 in Moody's book deals with whether or not families should provide for their own, and it's kind of a big issue these days with a different administration in place to see where all this kind of goes. We've had a pretty stable situation with respect to certain types of support over the years, and hopeful that that will remain in place. People still have the same kinds of needs. So more than half of all Americans over 65 are still married. However, advanced age frequently brings a need for caregiving. And older spouses are likely to be impaired, so that makes it kind of difficult for them to provide caregiving for their spouse if they have their own impairments. And so this whole concept of the exchange theory of aging comes into play, and that kind of looks like, so you were my child and I took care of you growing up, and maybe I put you through college and I made sure you had straight teeth and whatever, and you've gone on, good job, family of your own, so forth, and now all of a sudden mom and dad need some assistance, and so maybe it's time for the son or daughter to provide that assistance to their parents, who gave them a great deal of assistance for probably close to 20 years. So they're reciprocating that support to each other. Doesn't happen as much in the United States as it does in other countries and other cultures. Hopeful that will increase. It looks like it's on the rise. And unfortunately, the overwhelming majority of care for older folks is still provided by women. There is such a thing as the sandwich generation, which really impacts caregiving responsibilities on middle-aged women who may be taking care of their older parents and at the same time taking care of either their own young children or their grandchildren. And so this puts that caregiver in kind of a dual role, and pretty easy to kind of burn out in that kind of situation. So the common stereotype that older people seem to be abandoned by their children is pretty much not true. Nearly half of all older adults reported that they lived or expected to live in proximity to their children, 2/3 of them within 30 minutes of a child. 3/4 of older adults talk on the phone at least weekly with their children, and more of them, more than 40%, speak daily. But the patterns have been changing over the last 50 years, and the idea of sharing a household and an extended family has dropped off significantly. We have this sort of idealized image of the world we've lost, of the golden age of pre-industrial society. Nuclear families really are only the parents and children in the household, and this has been a trend in Western societies for quite some time, actually. So families typically today remain in close and frequent contact. It's coined intimacy at a distance. It reflects kind of a common desire by the older people to live independently, yet at the same time remain close enough to have regular contact with their grown children. Technology has certainly aided in this endeavor with things like FaceTime and Skype and all kinds of opportunities to communicate online. And And a big reason for this change in living arrangements over this past century is that there are many more people now living much longer lives, and thus, because of that, they require help at some point with activities of daily living. Long-term care has kind of remained largely a family responsibility in the U.S., despite what you might think. Spousal responsibility is deeply embedded in our culture as a matter of both ethics and law. In fact, there are a number of states that have laws on the books that could require adult children to support their aging parents, but these are largely unenforced or very difficult to enforce. If a spouse is unable to provide the care, then other family members such as children or siblings often take responsibility for that person. So it's known as filial responsibility, and it deals with the expectation that family members will care for each other. It is an implicit cultural assumption that is often interpreted ambiguously in the context of law, custom, and ethics, commonly taught in some cultures, sometimes to the extent of expecting adults to provide care for aging parents over their own children, and that typically is there's some very strong filial responsibility laws on the books in China and to a lesser degree in other Asian countries. So it's very much a cultural phenomenon, and these same kinds of responsibilities carry over into segments of our population in this country who have those cultural origins. So how can we best support this sense of responsibility that families have for their elders? And the other question is, how should government respond to the high cost of paying for care? So this is really kind of a political football as well as a moral one, in terms of who really is responsible for the welfare of older adults, parents particularly. So we have some systems in place in this country. Later in the term we'll get into these more in detail, but Medicare is a kind of a universal system for people over 65 years old. Doesn't pay a lot on nursing home costs, a couple percent. And it's primarily coverage for what would be called acute diseases, and acute diseases are those that are kind of temporary. You may have, I don't know, pneumonia for a while or something like that, as opposed to long-term diseases that could be cancer, could be heart disease, could be diabetes, could be obesity, could be lung cancer, all kinds of possible diseases like that. And the other one is Medicaid. In California we call it Medi-Cal, and it's kind of a joint governmental program supported by both the federal and the state. It was created in 1965 primarily to provide health care for the poor. It pays for about a third of nursing home costs, but it is also a key factor not only just for the poor, but in nursing home coverage for middle-class older adults as well. This particular program has been in the news quite a bit recently, as there's legislation floating around, or will be floating around, that will dramatically impact the amount of support that the federal government will provide for Medicaid or Medi-Cal patients. So the jury's still out on where we're going to go. So something to watch and be mindful and concerned about. So the idea of financing long-term care becomes more difficult each year as the prices are going through the roof. Medicaid can and does determine eligibility based on income and a person's assets. So typically, Medicaid has been the fastest growing component of state budgets and has become the public program of last resort to pay for nursing homes. Studies have shown, however, that while government-funded home care may be more desirable, it doesn't necessarily save money where you'd think it would. And it's kind of this woodwork effect, so government policymakers are afraid of people coming out of the woodwork to demand services that families have been providing. So as individuals and families become more aware of the cost of this long-term care, some middle-class families have found ways of qualifying for Medicaid. The classic way is what's called Medicaid spend down. So they literally get rid of their assets, impoverish themselves, if you will, spending all the incomes and assets to qualify for Medicaid. So this is kind of a desperate situation, but a lot of families have done it over the years. There's this idea of divestment planning, which is appearing to be poor by taking advantage of legal loopholes to avoid the Medicaid trap. It's really unknown how many families do this, but there are enough people to sustain a rapidly growing body of elder law attorneys that keeps them in business. So then there are the readings for this particular controversy. Strauss and Lederman deal with the purpose of Medicaids and what's required to apply for it. We'll talk a little bit more further in, but this is a really good kind of framework for you to begin learning more about this. It will be part of your life going forward. The next deals with this whole idea of spending down in order to qualify for Medicaid. This article deals with that. Shame on the rich. It's really not the rich, but the middle class. The really rich have too much money to get rid of, so it's probably more difficult for them. Next reading is that is there another way of thinking about the issue? So I would look at all of these readings actually in the course of your study of this controversy to get a deeper understanding. This stuff is very important to all of us because we all live and die, but we also face, all of us face some sort of health issue at least once or twice in our lives. So very critical. And the next article deals against paying someone in the family to provide caregiving. It can go either way. I mean, the family caregivers can be wonderful. They can be not so good. And so this author talks about a number of pros and cons on this whole issue, and I think it's pretty important as well as part of this whole package. And then finally, this last article deals with if you're paying a caregiver, does it change the relationship between the caregiver and the recipient? And if there are changes, are they negative or positive? So something to think about.